Okay, welcome, Dr. Muzammal Hussain. Today's podcast, our guest is Muzammal Hussain, a pioneer among Muslims in the UK, involved in grassroots ecological work for nearly 2 decades. He's passionate about restoring wholeness to create mutually beneficial relationships between the earth and communities. Muzammal is an emotional breakthrough therapist, medical doctor, and author of Radical Healing, Wholeness and Islam. He's completed permaculture courses, and he facilitates group learning and empowerment, drawing on his background in permaculture, natural healing, and conscious group work approaches. Dr. Muzammal, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and by all means, just call me Muzammal.
Yeah, let's get straight into it then. Can you just talk a bit about your background? How did you go from an ordinary person into dedicating a significant portion of your work towards the environment, permaculture, emotional healing? How did this come about, this passion of yours?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a big question. I think for me, one of the, I used to be into exercise. I still am, and I'd be reading some of the magazines, and that will also go into territory around the kind of, I guess, alternative aspects, alternative healing, and the value of the mind. So I began to open up to, aspects that in society weren't necessarily taken that seriously, about how the mind can influence the body and so on. So that body mind aspect came in my teens, when I would be working out pretty regularly, and I also learned a form of meditation that was helpful in giving deeper experiences. And then I went to medical school. So I had these sort of two worlds in medical school, where I was, on the one hand, getting interested in natural healing and the kind of power of consciousness with the body, and also kind of getting exposure to a very mechanical medical system. And so I would go to lectures and so on, and I would also attend in this place called Alternatives in London, where they'd have kind of pioneering speakers like, I guess, Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson and people like that. And I would get exposed to this whole other sort of way as well. And that sort of, I would say, was the beginnings of living in these sort of two worlds. And I began to get more engaged with Islam over the years as well. And that kind of merged for me Islam, healing, and also the point I guess I want to bring in here is that near the end of my time in medical school, I became aware that genetically modified food was being imported from the US and labeled into the UK, and was just connected with a few people, a network that was concerned about that. And I thought, well, where's my place of power in this, that GM foods are being imported into the UK unlabeled? Where's my place of power? And there are people like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. They're doing work generally in society, and I thought my place of power is in the Muslim community, and that's where I began to research and learn about an Islamic framing of our relationship with nature, and led me onto that trajectory as well. And there's more to the story I could say about the healing aspects and so on, but that's maybe a beginning, I think.
Okay, yeah, and you created LINE, right, which was the London Islamic Ecology Group.
Yeah, so LINE stands for the London Islamic Network for the Environment, which doesn't exist now. It evolved into Wisdom in Nature. So the whole GM food and Islam path made me the kind of go-to person in that sphere. So I would sometimes get invited to, I guess, Islamic events, and I would give a talk around GM foods, ecology, and Islam. That would be my sort of pet topic. I had done a website where I'd really brought a lot of that together as well, bringing together my knowledge as well through having been to med school and the science background into the kind of spiritual and religious domain, and bringing those aspects together. So giving these talks on GM food and Islam in those sort of settings, I would come across other Muslims, and they would be surprised to to connect with another Muslim who, excuse me, who was interested in Islam and ecology. They thought I was the only one, you know, they would think of themselves. And so I would come across the occasional person, and therefore I felt the next step, the next level would be to bring people together, you know, and then see what we can co-create. So that's how the London Islamic Network for the Environment formed.
I see. And just going back a bit to your medicine degree, what did you find that was so mechanical about what you were learning in medicine, and you thought it needed something a bit more?
Yeah. So, I mean, modern medicine, and I value it, I use it, you know, but I think we need to understand anything within its own assumptions in order to know when it's useful and when something else could be more appropriate, or when things can be combined together. And I think one of the premises of modern medicine is it tends to be reductionist. It does draw on science, but a more reductionist science. You know, what's the problem, you know, here? What's the symptom? You know, what's going on in this bit here, and how can we intervene in the pathway, you know, in order to prevent something happening in that pathway, rather than maybe looking at the whole ecosystem within the body, and maybe even beyond that into the social dimension as well, and those influences. I'm not saying it doesn't do some of that, there's public health and so on, but things tend to be quite fragmented. And so there's a sort of mechanical worldview within which I think medicine tends to sit. I think it's fairly fair, largely to say.
It's interesting because in some ways, the issue with climate change and the environmental crisis is also very similar to that. Very, like, as you mentioned about, they don't look at the whole ecosystem. With the issue of like CO2 emissions, the solutions are very technical and looking at one particular fragmented part, as you put it, or geoengineering. They're just going to take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yes.
Look at the overall ecosystem of biodiversity and atmospheric loading and the entire planetary boundaries and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
It's quite similar, actually.
It is, and I think we're leaning into the concept of Tawheed, of oneness, of unity, that we live in an interconnected world. And if we really want to effectively engage with any issue, any problem, and if we don't, within our approach, recognize the interconnectedness of the world we are in, we're not going to be as effective as we could be, and may even be causing problems in other parts of the ecosystem in trying to express our good intentions. We may be causing problems elsewhere that could have knock-on effects and actually make things worse. So yeah, it is similar in terms of CO2 emissions as well, whether we need to just focus solely on CO2 emissions or whether there's a bigger picture that we need to take into account. Yeah,
I think it's called the law of unintended consequences, if I remember correctly. Yeah, you mentioned Tawheed there. Can you talk a bit more about your personal Islam and your beliefs and how you link that to the environment? Because in my case, I think it took me a lot of reading to figure out there's actually a link between Islam and taking care of nature. It wasn't intuitive, or initially, but the way I was taught, it wasn't intuitive to me.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess my own relationship or understanding of Islam and ecology. I mean, the first thing I would say is that religions tend to be holistic, and they don't, you know, ultimately they're not compartmentalizing things as separate. You know, they're more embedded in the worldview of interconnectedness, and you know, and so, you know, also the question is, what is nature for me? And there's an automatic assumption, I think, when we talk about nature, is that we exclude the human world. You know, and so if we're actually talking about human beings, we are talking about nature. And the word environment is almost, I think, problematic. It may be, you know, if how we're using it is the worldview of separation, it's actually part of the problem. You know, so it's about, and I was kind of influenced by, also actually by as well as Islamic teachings by a book called Green Political Thought by Andrew Dobson, that made a distinction between environmentalism, a managerial approach to dealing with environmental issues, and ecologism, which is about a kind of real transformation in our worldview, in our state of being. And in Islamic perspective, the term Tawheed, and I actually wrote a little paper comparing actually Andrew Dobson's work and the Islamic sort of model, and found a lot of similarities between them. The concept of Tawheed is or let's say interconnectedness, reflects the underlying reality of oneness. And then there's also the references in Islam. I mean, to nature as well, whereby verses in the Quran are referred to as ayah, and nature in the Quran is referred to as ayah, and ayah means signs that point to the divine. So you could almost say that the Quran, which contains ayah, which are signs that point to the divine, the Quran isn't God, it points to God, is similar to nature. There's a relationship there, nature in, and I'm talking here, I am making a distinction, and there's a reason for that as well, so I think it is useful. The non-human natural world is in submission. Humans can deviate away from that, or we can align back to our fitra, our natural intrinsic state, and therefore fit into the whole, but nature is in submission. And so the book, the Quran, is there, and there's also the book of nature, which points to the divine through its beauty, through its intelligence, to the way it regenerates, and it's so efficient. So yeah, there's a connection in that's very kind of clear in the Quran, which is clear, but maybe sometimes we just need to be pointed to it.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, because in the growing up in the mosques and so on, you don't ever hear people talk about Islam and the environment. It's not really a hot topic. Maybe it'll become one now in the future going forward, but in the UK especially, I think it hasn't been taken seriously, the environmental crisis. Yeah.
I mean, it is emerging more, and it may depend where we live and what kind of kind of cultural norms there are within the Muslim communities around there. We're quite diverse, but yeah, there's a lot maybe to be said about where the emphasis is, and how we can engage, have a more engaged Islam, and what that means, and what's our kind of wider vision. So there's fundamental questions, I think, around that for me.
How successful was your work with networking with Muslims? Were there many people interested when you set up organizations like Line and Wisdom in Nature?
There were a handful. I mean, we would meet when Line started, we would meet in London every month. And I was partly influenced by, I had actually moved to Brighton, and I had started going to meetings of the World Development Movement and got involved in the anti-war movement. This was around 2002-03, and had a lot of learnings, and that contributed to the emergence of Line. It was already helpful having conversations with people from different ideologies, anarchists, socialists, peace activists, and so forth. Was really helpful, how they hold meetings and how they make decisions and those sort of things. So that kind of went into Line, along with some wonderful people that did come. It was tough work, because a lot of people who initially came may not have had much experience in the way of groups, in the way of decision making, in the way of commitment, accountability, and those sort of things that you need when you're coming together and collaborating together. But occasionally you'd get a kind of person who really held good qualities and contributed to the flourishing of the group. So it was a tough struggle, and in any one meeting we may have from 4 or 5 people to 16, 17, something like that. Sometimes you put a lot of effort in and there's only 3, and you think, and we would make it so the first half was maybe a talk and a discussion, the first hour, and the second hour was the actual meetings and what we've done, reporting back, what are we organizing. And it's kind of interesting, because people who came for the talk would also sit in and witness and slightly participate and feel a bit awkward in our sort of meeting of organizing and where do I sit in this, you know? So it challenged a few people, but it got us really good. And I really developed my ability to hold space with difference in that setting, which does get tiresome, you know, at some point, but it was an incredibly rich experience of how to hold space, how to work with difference while making practical decisions that you're quite serious about. Yeah.
And you've also have experience in permaculture. Could you just describe what permaculture is exactly?
Yeah, I began to hear a bit about it, and just my impression of it, and whoever's listening will have their own impression or no impression if they haven't really heard about it. My impression was that it's something kind of earthy and something that was around slowness and doing something with thought. And then I began to hear more about it, and I heard about a particular course that's called the Earth Activist Training that weaves together permaculture, social organizing, and earth-based spirituality. And yeah,
I get confused with permaculture and horticulture.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So okay, let me get back to, I guess, what permaculture is. I guess I'm missing the question there. Yeah. So permaculture is essentially it's not gardening. So let's just make that clear. It can be applied to the garden, but is essentially recognizing that nature demonstrates principles of regeneration, of sustainability, and we can learn from that nature is a teacher. So if we look at nature and we distill the principles that are held and embodied in nature, we can design human systems with those same qualities of regeneration, of sustainability. So you can apply it, yes, you can apply it to the garden, but human beings are part of that as well. So it's about the people that are there and the wider community. You can apply it to a social project as well. You can apply it to your own career and help to bring ecological awareness and thinking about how you can move forward in a way that connects with other aspects of life. So I would say permaculture, anyone you ask will give a different definition, but one of the key qualities is maximizing beneficial relationships between things. Okay. So the things already there, how can you maximize the relationship between things, be it things in the garden and human beings, or you know, in a mosque, the elements or the systems that are there? How can you, instead of bringing something in and being intensive and high, you know, kind of using high energy processes, what can we do with what's already there and to connect things up so they really maximize those relationships?
So this is like the opposite of the mechanical kind of ideas that you mentioned that you were discontented with in your degree. It's about bringing everything together.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, a very simple level, if you are working in the garden, where's the sun and where's the shade? You know, and many people are doing that already. And so what needs sun? So he's looking at needs, outputs and inputs, and you know, making those connections. So it is, yeah, it is definitely, as you're saying, it's more ecological. And one of the important aspects of it is not to launch into any changes that are going to be quite permanent. Before we do anything, we need to observe, we need to sense, we need to witness. It's the same. And one of the things about, and I mentioned the Earth Activist Training, and in particular, because one of the brilliant things I got out of that was the integration of social permaculture and land-based permaculture. And it really kind of became one for me. So if we're wanting to work on a piece of land, for instance, you know, it changes season by season. What we see in the winter, in the spring, all sorts of things are going to be there that we may not have known. And we want to know what's there, what naturally grows, in order to make the best use of it. We want to use those things that are already there. They give an indicator of the quality of the land. Similarly to a culture, if we go to a different culture, we want to understand the culture before we may want to, you know, if our role is to do something constructive, we don't just want to launch in. And a lot of NGOs, for instance, might do that. They may go into a culture and think they're doing great work, But hey, a lot of things are there that we don't understand why they're there, but they have useful functions, similar to in the garden and so on.
Okay, so it's like an anti-interventionist approach.
Yes, it's a working with and befriending and facilitative approach. Yeah.
I see. And you also mentioned spiritual healing. So what is that exactly?
I think I may have mentioned it, earth-based spirituality, maybe with the earth activist training. And that's maybe because the woman who pioneered earth activist training, that's her sort of background, which it was kind of woven into the permaculture course that I did, which, you know, in terms of how that manifested, there was, you know, I guess an appreciation of the elements, you know, of the wind, of the rain and so forth. And she brought in some of her own rituals that were there. And it was nice to have some rituals rather than in a secular course, for instance. It was kind of interesting. And I would sometimes translate how that might work in a sort of more Islamic sort of framing as well. And I also got a chance actually to give a talk on Islam and ecology in that.
So is this like
as well,
showing gratitude for things that God has, you know, created for us, like the alternation of night and day, the seasons and the regular,
yes,
and so on?
yeah. So there was, it's been a while now, but there was that aspect of gratitude, and maybe calling out to those elements as well that happened.
Okay. And you've got some background as in therapy as well. How does that, how did that come about?
So I guess I shared a little bit about my, you know, kind of exploration and experiences with beyond the medical model, and beginning to explore, you know, the connection of consciousness and the mind and healing. And I began to, I guess, get interested in the idea of doing Ayurvedic medicine after I had, you know, I was actually doing psychiatry at the time. But then I went to a talk at the same place in Alternatives in London by a woman who had healed from a tumor by getting to the emotional root cause of that tumor, along with using some nutrition. It wasn't a, you know, it was a benign tumor, but it was that big that her life was in danger. You know, that's what she was told by her doctor. She was bleeding because it was impinging on blood vessels. And so she got to the emotional root cause, resolved and forgave the people concerned at that deep level. So it was released, and her tumor, which was in her belly, a uterine tumor, it began to soften. It was the size of a football, apparently. It began to soften, and over a few days, you know, it went back to being healed.
Well, how does that happen? So you have a tumor, and then just from emotional release,
the possibility, I would just say the possibility is there. I'm not saying that any time anyone has it happened for her. She did also use nutrition and other things, but it's more after a particular process that involved emotional healing and forgiveness, that she felt a shift and began over the next few days just to notice her belly softening and it returning to normal. And she had an MRI scan that showed it to be normal as well.
Wow, that's good.
But I'm more talking of that as a source of inspiration, that I then started. I did an intensive in that approach called Journeywork, and was quite impressed by it in terms of what it did for me, in how it was able to go specifically into a block, an emotional block internally, and help us to face it fully, and to go even deeper than that, to a place of essence where we feel and experience a more expanded place, which I would say is actually the Ruh, the spirit, our contact place with the divine, essentially. And it's in that safe, expanded place where we can face difficult things safely, you know, without being rocked. And when we face pain that's stored there, that could be from whatever cause, then we can release it in a much more complete way. And also, because we're in a more expanded place, we're beyond the ego mind, we can get a sense of meaning, we can get a sense of why that experience was needed and why it happened. so we can be at peace with that experience. So it's a much more fully integrated process that involves awareness, putting our attention into the body as well. So it's a very embodied and spiritual, I would say, approach. And I wrote actually in the ebook, because I was trying to say, okay, how, I translate things into Islam as well. And so I was going to write a blog post and ended up writing, it became a lot longer, an ebook called Radical Healing, Wholeness and Islam, that kind of just to get my thoughts together on where this sort of sits from an Islamic perspective, because it is pretty profound.
Okay. When he's mentioning the expansion and so on, it reminds me of Surah Inshirah, which actually mentions the Prophet's chest was expanded.
Right.
Interesting metaphors there.
Yeah. And in many traditions, people speak of having this experience of oneness, which could be through spiritual practice. It could be spontaneous. It's not, no one religion necessarily has a monopoly on it, but all religions are, in part, I think, it's around really getting to that state of inner peace where you're really connected to your source.
And having done this course, how did that relate to your previous work in with the environment and ecology and permaculture?
Well, I would include this and also another approach that I explored called process work. The commonality is that with Journeywork, we're facing what is uncomfortable. If we're feeling anxiety, feel it. Where is it in the body? Just feel it. And then it begins to sort of soften and come through. So it's about facing what is difficult. And then process work is about facing what is difficult in a group, when a group or a community. So there's a commonality, I think, from that point of view. But they also have a psychotherapy approach as well. And where that came in is because, if we're doing ecological work as an individual and we're just making lifestyle changes, it's not necessarily that relevant. But if we're thinking, how do we organize together? How do we create the kind of world we want to live in a more collective way? Then we're going to face challenges working with one another, and it's going to activate us sometimes. It's going to trigger us sometimes, and also when we're looking at how to make decisions, how to move forward as a group, we want to listen to each other. We want to listen to what we say, but also there's underlying emotions. There's the emotional and inner landscape that we're not always comfortable articulating, and we may even feel isn't welcome. So for me, I found exploring individually in myself and with others this landscape that we tend to marginalize, the uncomfortable emotions of maybe anger or rage or frustration, and being okay with that at an individual level, and in process work at a group level where they've got tools to actually, they call it a hotspot when there's a moment of kind of, something's happening there in the group, that's tense. And in most instances, if people are talking, something's tense, they may change the subject or something, or someone may think they're actually doing a good deed by switching, or bypassing that. In process work, they will actually, they call it hotspot. And they will then say, okay, hotspot, we need to slow down and we need to go into it. And I found that when we can go into these things in a way that where we're allowing of it and willing to sit and explore it and listen within it and express what is there, that something transforms. And the bonding that occurs, through that process when it's complete, means that we can move forward in a way, working as a group for ecological, social justice, whatever we're doing, we can move forward in a way which is far more integrated. The alternative being that we bypass it, but it's still there, it's under the surface. That anger, that rage, that frustration, but you did this, or it's still there, that hasn't had a chance to be voiced. And that will sabotage the process later on, and things will take longer. So actually pausing to go deep and taking the time ultimately saves time and builds that more wholesome, integrated world that's what it contributes to, I feel, that we ultimately all want.
And has this had a profound impact on your own life, learning these techniques and practicing them?
Yeah, it's certainly, in terms of what I feel my life vision and mission is, in a way. I feel that the work is only real if we go deep. And even in permaculture, it's a design approach. And sometimes if we're just following steps without really listening deeply, so if we take the example of going into, seeing a piece of land, or going into a community where we may want to have some role to do something positive, if we're not listening deeply, but only listening at the surface and following some steps in a book, we're not really engaging with reality. We're not really engaging with what's there. And I found that the most profound, if I'm not engaging at that level, it doesn't feel meaningful. I get a sense that something's going to come back at us, if we're not connecting really and working through certain key things.
And has this helped you, or in terms of spirituality, in terms of Islam, like connecting with God and developing a better relationship with Him?
Right. Good question. Yeah. I mean, for instance, if I do Salah, then I'm more attentive to how my body is feeling. And I might put my attention onto the body if there's a place of unease or discomfort, and that part may soften, and I may offer that to God, and kind of expose that to the divine. Here I am in my fullness, in my brokenness, and so forth. And I find that a very powerful healing process. It slowed down my Salah, so I'm more embodied within that process. So I mean, it can, I think people may not often realize it, and I can do this myself. If we're feeling a bit of unease in ourselves when we do Salah, yes, it can give us peace, but it may be that we rush through it because we don't want to be still and open, where we may feel that unease a bit more fully, which can be uncomfortable. So it's actually made it a much more dynamic relationship with some of the Islamic practices for me. Also in fasting, where we can feel more sensitive and we can feel our emotions in a more refined way. I find it easier to go into those emotions and let them come through and clear out more fully.
Okay. And bringing the environment back in, what kind of things have you started? Like, how do you ensure a sustainable lifestyle in conjunction with this emotional healing and spiritual practices?
Okay, how do I personally, or how can people?
Personally, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I'm wondering how to approach this question. For me, it's around. I mean, the permaculture kind of approach is understanding one's own context and what is sort of possible. So there are times where, for instance, I have had land, and there are times where I haven't. At the moment, I don't have land. And so what is kind of natural, a way for me to engage can evolve. And then there's also around, yeah, I guess I'm aware of, yeah, I guess the question is at an individual level, and for me, the collective is so crucial. Okay. So at a collective level, I just want to name that, even though I'm happy to answer it at an individual level. It's what I'm doing with others. It's what I'm doing in relationship, and what we're co-creating together. So the co-creation of qualities of community that reflect the kind of world I want to be living in is where the heart of my work is. So wisdom in nature has evolved from London Islamic Network to the London Islamic Network for the Environment, has evolved into wisdom in nature, which has a focus on trainings and around coming together to activate these qualities of how we work together in the context of these crises that we're in, and to embody those communities, to help co-create those kinds of communities. And at an individual level, not to run away from the question completely directed in that way, it's about, I guess, just sensitivity to the constraints that are there and the beauty that is there as well. So one of the practices that I might do is just sit in nature. It's called sit spot, where you just sit in the same spot at a regular basis for about half an hour. And the reason it's half an hour, after about 20 minutes, is when other elements in nature get used to you being there, and they begin to respond. They begin to respond more according to their normal patterns. So you're there as part of nature rather than separate. So that's a practice that I've begun to cultivate more of. I'm aware of, for instance, things like flying as well, and activities that can be quite polluting, and will consider, if I'm going to make a journey to, is it going to be meaningful if I really am going to fly? There are times where, because of family, I would do that, but I would want to, for me, and I'm able to sometimes spend a bit of time, not just go for 2 or 3 days. And then in terms of food and where that comes from. So there's all these different elements. But I think the real changes are around how we come together in the world we're co-creating, because it's the system that has to transform. And lifestyle can help keep us on our toes. I need to do what I need to do to keep me on my toes. And it's about how we co-organize. Yeah.
Okay, I see. That's quite an interesting approach. The co-creation, I like that, because in some ways, yeah, I think I came across in my studies when we're influenced by the environment, but we also influence the environment as well. We exert our own influence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk more about the emotional part, because for me, I find it very difficult to, I'm not very emotional. And I find it difficult to just what's the word? Feel my emotions, if you know what that means. How do you, what would you give advice to someone like me? Someone who struggles to really connect with their own emotions. How can I start?
Yeah. First is to give yourself permission. Look at what beliefs are there that may be a hurdle, a barrier. What does it mean to feel emotions? What would it mean you are if you allowed yourself to do that? And so that can be useful. What is in our upbringing? What are the messages we've maybe heard around that, or some of the experiences that have come our way? On a sort of, that is a practical exercise, a reflective exercise, but also to sometimes take time. I would say at the beginning of Salah, to Muslims, before you begin, before you do the Allahu Akbar, just check in with your body. How are you feeling? Is there any place of tension or discomfort, any place of contraction? And attention is very powerful. A lot of healing is what we do with our attention. Meditation practices and Islamic practices is what we do with our attention. And if we bring our attention to that which is feeling contracted or feeling uncomfortable, our attention on that area in the body, so notice where it is in the body, just a little, just maybe a little contraction or holding, and just begin to, stay with it without trying to change it, without trying to make it something different, without trying to make it go away, just with full acceptance, and just notice what happens to that area. You might find there's a little bit of emotion or not, or some sensation, and just allow that to come through as well. And on my website, there's also a on restorativewholeness.com, there's also a little audio where I take a person through about 15 minutes through a guided exercise. If anyone wants to sign up for that, then a kind of guided exercise to feel into and open to what is there sensation wise and emotion wise.
Okay, I can put links for in the description for this video.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful to you.
No, it's interesting. My wife, she did some work for like a mental health organization for a while.
Yeah.
And touched on similar things as well.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad there's agreement.
Yeah. What advice would you have to people coming out of university or young professionals like myself in terms of who want to make a change, who want to do something positive when it comes to the environment? But sometimes we might think too grand and think, oh, we have to do X, Y, and Z, and if we don't, we're going to fail. What advice would you have to, especially I think young people coming out of university who are very idealistic and hopeful?
Yeah. Well, I would say find like-minded people. It's, you know, and maybe enter into spaces where radical thinking, and I say radical in the sense of really getting to the root of issues, where radical, deep, reflective thinking around this is happening. It can be useful to do a permaculture intro course, for instance, a 2-day course or something like that. We offer permaculture trainings, and on the Wisdom in Nature website there is a starter course of 10 hours weaving Islam, permaculture, both social and land-based, where people, it's an anytime course, but it's quite immersive and interactive, and there's quiz questions, so that's something that is there as well. But I think to find people and begin to have conversations and be inspired by one another. If you can create a space where conversations can happen, then and people speak openly, then needs can be expressed. Those needs can be heard and responded to, and people who have, you know, a wonderful vision for the world coming together to discuss can lead to all sorts of possible creativity and other connections and so forth. So I think there's a real power in that. And if that can't happen in person, then there's online stuff. And we also, I get in Wisdom in Nature, we have online forums. We've got one coming up in March, where we also have breakout groups where people can discuss. We've got a speaker coming and a conversation happening, for instance. So, and there's other spaces as well where that happens. So there is quite a lot there where people can come together, and you'll hear then about other trainings and courses that may be of interest, where you'll, you know, and that ecosystem, that web, those connections will develop and will become stronger. So I guess I'm putting a real focus here on connections and that permaculture principles of beneficial relationships between people. So it's finding those people. And on a personal level, yeah, if you've got some land and you can sit with nature, find a way to connect, that's really beautiful. When we experience the beauty of the earth we are in, we want to take care of it. You know, that which we give attention to, that which we listen to, we begin to care more for.
Great, that's wonderful. I'll definitely put links for Wisdom in Nature in the description.
Cool.
One final observation is I've noticed you don't talk much about policy. You talk about connection a lot more, and I can tell it's very important to you. Why do you think it's so important that this idea of connection and, you know, co-creation and so on, more than just policy and things here and there?
Well, it's not that I don't think it's necessarily important. It's what I'm drawn to and where my strength is. And I think there's a lot of people working at the policy level, and I used to be more in that realm as well. I feel that, you know, policy happens within a context, and it happens in the context of the structures and political systems we exist in. So I'm actually not fearful of politics. I definitely go there, but it's what kind of politics, what kind of systems and structures do we want? And I feel that the current systems of nation states that we have and the kind of governments that are common, that's something quite new in human history. It's probably not going to last. And it's not necessarily the way that is of service to where we want to go. I would just put that as a question. And I'm quite inspired by autonomous communities like the Zapatistas, for instance, and also in northern Syria and Rojava, the ecofeminist sort of movement there, where people have found and are embodying other ways of collectivizing, of being together and meeting one another's needs in a way that isn't of the government's systems that we have at the moment. And where each person is actively empowered and engaged. Maybe that's a bit similar to how the community in Medina was at the time of the Prophet. You know, it was bonded together, you know, because of common aims and purpose, you know, and ethico-political commitments, as someone called Muhammad Abdu, he points out in a book he you know that he wrote. So this, you know, it's kind of like, what kind of world do we want? And that's where relationship, bonding, and imagining is, to me, really key. Creating the qualities of those communities that we want to see in the world.
Yeah. And do you think, as you mentioned with co-creation, do you think engaging in the current political context, not that it's wrong or anything, but there is an element of, by engaging in a particular way, or in the way that's recommended, or whatnot, like writing to MP and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
or campaigning with as an NGO or whatnot, we are reinforcing the strength of that system, and there has to be some movement which also counteracts that system reinforcing itself.
Yeah, I think we can have both. You know, I mean, I did support the strikers. You know, physically was there, and you know, yeah, it's very easy when we're engaged at the policy level and trying to change things within the existing system, because we only have so much time and energy, that we can get drowned in that. And I benefit from people who do that, you know, as well, you know. So I'm not, it's not, we can live in a world where things can be quite polarized. It's either this or this. I say we do need that. For me, I'm kind of reflecting, how can, if I'm in those spaces, how can what I bring also, perhaps with others who are like-minded, also in the protest, also can we somehow embody the kind of world we want to co-create? Can that somehow be there as well? And you know, there are movements like Extinction Rebellion, for instance, they tried to do that. They had examples of regenerative culture and what that was like, or what that is like, within their demonstrations and protests and so forth. So, you know, it's there. There are people who want to do both.
All right, great. Dr. Muzammal, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you for spending your time with me. And do send me those links, and I'll get them in the description below.